Welcome to Start Your Podcast Now. I am Paul the Podcast Guy, and this is the podcast where I take my 10 years of radio and PR experience and turn it into practical advice for starting your very own podcast. If you want to find out more about my experience, want to know more tips and tricks, or would like to hear me read the collected works of Dr. Seuss and various Homestar Runner voices, email me at paul@paulthepodcastguy.com. Now, you'll notice that I am not doing this week's episode on video again. Well, the whole thing is, with a newborn, you get a little less time than you thought you would. So I'm trying to take as little time out in my studio as I can because my daughter, well, is a little bit more important than this. This episode is brought to you by procrastination. Insert ad copy here. Procrastination. I'll come up with a tagline tomorrow. As always, we venture into the bottomless pit of topics to see what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, let's see what we got here. You need to do more topical podcast news. That's a little bit vague, BPOT. Perhaps you could be more specific. Okay, let's reach back in. Okay. Talk about the Ron Burgundy Podcast. Ah, yes, the Ron Burgundy Podcast. In honor of this story, today's inspirational quote that doesn't suck comes to us from Ron Burgundy, the treasure of San Diego himself. He said, "I'm very important. I have many leather-bound books, and my apartment smells of rich mahogany." While I'd be happy to spend time discussing the various types of mahogany, Cuban, Honduran, African, and their varied woodworking properties, as well as tonal properties for guitars, I need to stay focused. Yes, this quote isn't inspirational, but it's one of the few great lines I can repeat from Ron that will be acceptable on a family-friendly show like this. Plus, it's awesome. So why am I choosing this particular podcast to discuss? Why is this newsworthy? There are some unique things about this podcast that I believe signify a huge shift in the popularity and perception of podcasts as a whole. I should point out, for those of you who don't know, Ron Burgundy is a fictional character. He's played by Will Ferrell and was in the Anchorman movies, one of which is legendary, and the other one is more, oh yeah, I forgot they made a sequel. Ron is, in the movie, a TV news anchor in San Diego, and is basically an excuse for Will Ferrell wackiness and fake smarm. Anchorman has a lot of Saturday Night Live alumni, and back when I was still in the media, it was treated like the gold standard in comedies about what it's like being in the news. Far and above news radio, far and above WKRP in Cincinnati, and quotes from Anchorman were rampant. Now, let's get started discussing this podcast, and as usual, I'll do this in list format. Number 1. The advertising. It seemed like a joke when Ron Burgundy tweeted under the Twitter handle Burgundy Podcast to CNN anchor Don Lemon, saying, quote, "Hello, @Don Lemon, it's your good friend Ron Burgundy. Don't know if you heard, but I recently had my White House press credentials pulled. They accused me of eating too many hot dogs in the press break room. They said I ate 12 dogs. I only ate 4 dogs. I'm not Kobayashi, for cripe's sake. Anyway, old friend, was wondering if you could do me a favor." Lemon replied, "Mr. Burgundy, I gotta be honest, I don't remember ever meeting you, and frankly, I'm a little shocked you have White House press credentials. I know I stand for a free press and all, but just not so sure you should have those credentials." Burgundy then tweeted back, "Don, I am laughing out loud. So about that favor, the media landscape is changing so fast, and I do not care for it. That's why I'm starting a podcast." They traded some more tweets, but you get the gist. Later, it was confirmed by iHeartMedia that Funny or Die would be producing 24 episodes of the Ron Burgundy Podcast spread across 2 seasons. iHeartRadio just released a video trailer on YouTube to promote the series, which I will link to in the show notes. Now, I thought the trailer was funny. You see Ron asking a series of ridiculous questions while sitting in a typical Hollywood-looking radio broadcast room. They're rarely that nice in real life, though props to the team for having him use a Shure SM7B microphone, which is what I'm using to record today's podcast. We used those in the production booth at the station I worked at, and they are fantastic. The questions come rapid fire and they're all sports related. It's then revealed that Ron is talking to a costumed mascot, and Burgundy gets annoyed because he realizes this interview will be like pulling teeth. There's a woman on mic in the background, but she doesn't talk in the trailer, so no idea who she is. The thing is, as cute as I find this trailer, it does make me concerned for the podcast itself. More on that in a minute. Number 2. What will this podcast actually be like? Since Will Ferrell is one of the owners of Funny or Die, the production company that will be making the podcast, I'll have to assume that he'll be doing the podcast himself and not relying on a sound-alike, especially if they actually do the podcast on video. Plus, he's the one in the trailer, so it makes the most sense. No word on whether any other alumni from the movie series will be involved, but for the sake of longevity, I would hope so. The best lines from the movies aren't just from Ron, they're also from the characters around him, like Brick Tamland, played by Steve Carell, Veronica Corningstone, played by Christina Applegate, and Brian Fantana, played by Paul Rudd. The charm of the movie was largely Burgundy's interactions with these other characters, and how clueless they all were, save Applegate's character. If Burgundy is left to do all the talking, even if he's interviewing guests completely in character and given a bunch of good one-liners, I fear it's going to get monotonous. A good joke run into the ground is tiring. I mentioned that the trailer both amused and concerned me. If the whole shtick is how awkward these interviews are, with Burgundy acting clueless and the guests either getting irritated with him or are equally clueless, I think it's going to get old. I dubbed this podcast the Ghostbusters 3 Dilemma. Let me explain. Fans of Ghostbusters 1 have long desired to see a Ghostbusters 3, which actually looks like it's in production now. Dan Aykroyd championed this for years with varied interest from Bill Murray. The death of Harold Ramis seemed to seal the fate of Ghostbusters 3 with the closest thing we'd ever get, we thought, turning into the poorly received Ghostbusters reboot from 2016. The thing is, more material from the world of Ghostbusters, just like Anchorman, isn't something we really seem to want, which was proved by the failure of the second movies in both of these series. Ghostbusters 2 and Anchorman 2 were produced by the people who made the first in the series. The original cast, the original writing team, the original producers, everything. It had the best chance of success. And yet, audiences still treated both of these movies like lukewarm rat's milk. What makes us think that another one is going to satiate us? More material from the world of Ron Burgundy, even with all the team from the originals on board, isn't a guarantee of success. And huge changes in the formula will most likely doom the project. Much like the complete change of Ghostbusters in 2016, changing casts, going with an entirely new script, basically just remaking the first movie, and then, in this case, changing Burgundy's circumstances to a podcast from a movie is a gamble, and a risky one. Number 3. What does this mean for podcasts in general? This is the highest profile podcast I can think of that banks on the personality of a fictional character. Every other major podcast I can think of relies on real people, even if they're dramatized versions of themselves. And fictionalized podcasts usually are narrated by someone telling a story or are done in the style of a radio play. The Ron Burgundy Podcast is almost like the Eric Andre Show, or actually more fittingly, the Larry Sanders Show. The Eric Andre Show is comedian Eric Andre doing a wacky talk show where he basically plays pranks on his guests. Yes, Eric Andre plays himself, but only kinda. It's more of a character. It would be like if the character of Ron Burgundy went by Will Ferrell. That's how different Eric Andre is from his on-screen persona. The Larry Sanders Show was Garry Shandling playing the fictional Larry Sanders, but performing actual interviews in a talk show setting, then doing scripted scenes when the fictional talk show would end. I can't think of another high-profile podcast that does this. Usually a podcast is the place where a celebrity gets to be himself and talk extemporaneously. But with the Conan O'Brien podcast, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, which is Conan being a more fictionalized version of himself, the floodgates seem to have been opened. It's like instead of, say, Joe Rogan doing the Joe Rogan Experience, he was in character as Joe Garelli from the news radio sitcom. This, I think, is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, podcasts are increasingly seen as a legitimate mainstream form of entertainment to the point where A-list celebrities are not only willing to turn on a mic and pontificate, but they're willing to put time and energy into scripted, character-driven series. This brings podcasts to ears they may not have otherwise reached. On the other side of the coin is the fact that podcasting has had very few trends. Podcasts, like movies from the 60s and 70s, have been incredibly varied, with only Serial really creating a series of notable clones that are very specifically and obviously trying to ride on its coattails. A bit more about this analogy. In the 60s and 70s, the top-grossing movies, as well as the ones that won Oscars, could have been any kind of movie. Crime dramas, fantasies, comedies, action thrillers, sci-fi, anything. It was all about the story and how it was told. Then comes Star Wars in 1977, and forever the top-grossing movies are huge special effects extravaganzas, which has only become more pronounced since the Marvel Universe became the juggernaut it is today thanks to Iron Man in 2008. Movies that are genuinely boring or even downright awful can still make back their budget and be considered successful just because they're pretty to look at. Transformers, Avatar. I've mentioned before that the charm of podcasts is anyone can do it. As long as you're creative enough, you can do anything with audio on a very minimal budget. Sound effects, for example, are very inexpensive. But with celebrity-driven podcasts featuring increased budgets and featuring familiar characters, I fear that podcasts with huge advertising budgets and celebrities will increasingly put the emphasis on, quote, premium podcasts and lead to a homogeny among podcasts, that there will be a very specific kind that everyone will gravitate towards and will make all the money. And I especially fear that we may be heading too close to the path that podcasts are going to have to be bought to listen to, or are only available on paid services. I've talked before about the alteration of the landscape with podcasts possibly going the way of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and YouTube Premium. And there may be a stigma towards free podcasts, the same way we associate with made-for-TV movies or direct-to-video from decades past, which of course would be a shame. I hope I'm wrong, but when big players begin pouring money into mediums that are zero cost for the consumer, I rarely see that as a good thing for the little guy. YouTube was completely free once upon a time. Now, want to watch that new Karate Kid series Cobra Kai? You better pay a subscription fee. You want to stay on YouTube for free? Get used to clicking no, I don't want to sign up for YouTube Premium every single time you watch a video. Now, none of this is meant to sound doom and gloom. Really, I promise you. I can't guarantee a trend from one podcast, but I believe the signs have been pointing this way for some time. Big players go where the money is. Voice actors have been dealing with this for a very long time. Once upon a time, the voice actor was pretty much invisible, Mel Blanc being a notable exception, but that's only because after being refused a raise by Warner Brothers, he asked that all Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons feature the credit vocal characterizations by Mel Blanc, even when he wasn't the sole voice in a cartoon. Arthur Q. Bryan was the voice of Elmer Fudd, for instance. But as time went on and more attention was paid to voice actors, more and more celebrities turned to voice acting. Disney is most responsible for this, I believe, turning the celebrity voices into marketing opportunities. While there were still some high-profile jobs going to voice actors, such as Babe the Pig being voiced by Christine Cavanaugh, and Bugs Bunny in Space Jam being voiced by Billy West, and it's still happening to a certain extent with Jim Cummings doing the voice of Winnie the Pooh in the Christopher Robin movie, it is increasingly rare. And commercials aren't safe either. Instead of hiring a voice actor, why not just get Tom Selleck to voice those Tropicana commercials, or Gene Hackman for Lowe's? Heck, film stars have even filtered onto TV cartoons, with Sean Astin, aka Rudy or Samwise Gamgee, and the dude from American Pie, Jason Biggs, voicing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They weren't even heavily marketed as the stars. It's now getting to be a matter of course that film stars do the voices on cartoons. I mean, why wouldn't they? So the Burgundy Podcast may be successful, and it may be an indication of trends to come. I honestly think, though, that the podcast itself won't be that huge. The first couple episodes may top the iTunes charts, but I doubt it will have staying power if they don't really craft that show with fresh material on a constant basis, as well as get in other characters and writers from the movies. It does signify, though, a possible trend in podcasting. But I will leave you with this. I believe and always will believe that content itself is king. Podcasts are still a medium where the average person with enough grit and determination can be hugely successful. Lore being one of the best examples. And the great thing about podcasts is that it can lead to bigger things. It can help people break into, quote, the big time. It's happened with YouTube personalities, such as Miranda Sings, real name Colleen Ballinger, getting her own Netflix series, and it's happened with podcasts, such as the aforementioned Lore, getting turned into an Amazon Prime series. Work hard, spread the word about your podcast, and make it good, and you will find your audience. That's something the big dogs with a lot of money struggle to do too, and that's something that also will never be beholden to a trend. So you see, I told you it wouldn't be all doom and gloom, that the trends wouldn't guarantee success for anybody, and you can still get away with making really awesome stuff that will capture the imagination of the populace. It just may be a bit more of an uphill battle. Now, normally I do podcast roulette at this point, so we can find out what you should be listening to this week. But I'd just like for you to watch the Ron Burgundy Podcast trailer for yourselves and make your own determination. Do you get the same vibe I do? As always, you can find me, Paul the Podcast Guy, on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can check out my website for how I can help you create your own podcast. That's paulthepodcastguy.com. And until next time, Start your podcast now.